Welcome to CLI's 15 on Friday. Our mission is to empower schools and communities to transform instruction so children can thrive. Each month, we connect with educators, authors, librarians, and advocates of high quality education for children. Today, I have the pleasure of chatting with Dr. Shelby Kretz, founder of Little Justice Leaders. Shelby, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Priscilla. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Awesome. Before we dive into all things Little Justice Leaders, could you tell us about your own education journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So, thinking back to my journey when I was younger, I think that I had a okay public school, education, and some really amazing teachers that stood out and really supported me and mentored me and kind of pushed me to become who I am today. And that was through, K through college. And then ended up going back to school for graduate school later on as well. And obviously just kind of fell in love with education. That's what I got my PhD in education and the opportunity of education. I do feel like I had a decent public school education, and yet there is so many ways that it could have been more impactful. It could have been more meaningful and more deep in many ways, I guess. And that's kind of what I really care about now.
Yeah, that's awesome. As your PhD is in urban education.
Yeah.
How did you see social justice sort of intersect with early ed? And how did that inspire your decision to start Little Justice Leaders?
Yeah, good question. So for me, we really can't be talking about education if we're not also talking about justice, just because for one, I think one of the main goals of education is to educate young people to become good citizens. And if we want young people to become good citizens, then they have to understand the world around them. And that means understanding the challenges, the injustices and justices in our world and what that looks like. I think the second piece is that our education system, like all of our systems, have been rooted in injustice. And so if we aren't talking about justice when we're talking about education, then we're ignoring the kind of basis that our education system was built on. And if we're not intentionally pushing for justice, then we're just going to be replicating the injustices of the system. So for me, they were always just so very intertwined.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a really succinct point. You kind of can't have one without the other just based on how our structures are set up.
Exactly, exactly. And so I thought a lot about, social justice and education while I was in school. And that was around the time as well of the 2016 election,
Mhm.
where a lot of young people were starting to take in media more than they ever had in the past, right? There was the intersection of, more technology, social media, iPads, and everyone having phones, and the highly charged election that was happening and the rhetoric that was often hateful, and just really, really highlighting all of the injustice in our world and the need for a push for justice. So all of those things kind of came together. And I think it left a lot of teachers asking, what do I do? And parents too, like how do I address this with my kids, right? They're seeing it online, they're hearing it in the neighborhood from their friends, and I have no idea where to start. And kind of all of that came together. And it wasn't until 2018 that I started Little Justice Leaders, but that's kind of when it clicked like, oh, maybe this is something I can help with, like how to bring these topics to young people and start having these conversations.
That's awesome. That kind of knocks my next question out of the park. So I'm going to hit you with a different one.
Okay.
So when it comes to making these resources accessible, how does Little Justice Leaders sort of package doesn't feel like the right word, but I'm going to use package
Yeah.
these sorts of lessons and this heart into accessible materials for teachers and caregivers.
Yeah. So there are so many different aspects of like accessibility that we think about, right? The first is how can we get this out to as many people as possible without cost being a barrier? And so that we approach by giving out tons of resources for free online. So that's what we do. A lot of our stuff is free. You don't need to pay anything to get access to it. The other thing we're doing is working directly with schools. so that teachers can access these resources without paying out of pocket, so that, young people can access these resources through just their everyday school experience. I think, other things we think about when we think about accessibility is like, what is the content itself? Who's making it? How is it created? How are we ensuring that it's like, going to connect for all students? And for that, we think a lot about collaboration. Like, how many folks can we bring into this process to have different, experiences, different perspectives represented at the table to ask questions like, hey, would this, activity be accessible for a student with a disability? Would this, activity be work for, all different groups or whatever it might be, any students, for teachers, that kind of thing. And then the last thing when we think about accessibility is this easy for a teacher to do? Because we know teachers are so overtaxed. They have way too much to do as it is. We don't want to add more to their plate. We want to make their lives easier. So with every lesson, we're thinking, how can we give them everything they need to kind of pick up and go and not have to do all of the research, because there is so much research that goes into any topic of social justice. Nobody can be an expert on everything. And yet we need them to know enough that they don't cause harm in doing the lesson. So that's a balancing act as well. So I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know what you meant by accessibility, but we think about it in so many different ways.
I think you hit the nail on the head with that one. It really does encompass specifically like with caregivers, for example, it's so much easier when we put the resources directly online.
Yeah.
Like at CLI, we also
Mhm.
do that just so folks can go in and look at just what's happening in the classroom when we're there.
Mhm.
So,
Exactly.
nail on the head.
Yeah, yeah. And so we actually started out as a subscription box company. And I think a lot of people still think of us as a box, box organization. Like they think of our boxes when they think of us. We did that for 6 years and I loved it. It was so much fun. And it made it less accessible because of the cost of, putting together the kits every month. So it just was not as accessible. So we completely got rid of that. There was also like a sustainability component in terms of environmental resources and that kind of thing. And so we got rid of that and now everything is online, which makes even our paid product, even our like paid options, a lot more accessible. So folks can get a lot more content for a much more reasonable price. And so yeah, that's another way we've thought about like accessibility, which
I love that.
Mhm.
Hand in hand, sort of with making it so that there's easy access to the materials your team works on. How can we encourage and cultivate spaces rooted in social justice inside and outside of the classroom?
Yeah, good question. So I always think that when we start with young people and teaching young people about justice, it tends to kind of like expand into all of the spaces because kids have a very natural inclination for fairness and for justice. We all know this. If you've been around kids, they're always going to be saying, like, that's not fair. They call things out when they're not fair, right? And so when we start to talk to them about issues that matter, they immediately connect. And they also are happy to be included in conversations about things that matter, things that feel real in the world, and things that feel important. And so they get curious. They bring this everywhere. They bring the lens everywhere. So if you're a caregiver who's talking to your, kids, let's say about gender diversity, for example, they're going to be calling you out when you're making gender assumptions, whether you like it or not, whether it's the time when you sat down to talk to them about it or not. Wherever you are, they're going to call you out for that. And that's a beautiful thing with kids. So it kind of makes you as an adult hold yourself accountable too. So I think that's like a good place to start. I think it's also just noticing. Just start with noticing, like wherever you are, noticing, are there stereotypes being portrayed in a movie you're watching with your kids? Are there, you know, is there bias in books that you're reading? Is there bias in the books that you've, cultivated for your home library or your school library? And so I think just putting on that lens of looking for it everywhere we go, we start to find these opportunities to recognize bias, interrupt it and talk about it with young people, even if it's not kind of in like an official kind of learning setting.
I love that. I know in my personal life, I tend to try to diversify all of the libraries of the littles of my life. Like, I'm going
Yes.
to be intentional and go out and see, all right, what's an author that's lacking in
Hmm.
your home library that I could just casually put on your shelf and we'll read it together for story time later. So
I
I
love that.
find that.
Yes, and I think it makes, it feels like a small thing we can do, but it really makes such a huge difference. Like
Right.
the books that young people read is in many ways like their world, right? Besides obviously what we can expose them to in real life, which is wonderful. But there are limits to that, right? Where depending on where we live, who's in our community, that kind of thing. So there's just so much opportunity there with books.
Yeah, I love it. Segueing into it. So when I first heard of Little Justice Leaders, I think it was, my gosh, I think it would have been around 6 years ago when you guys were still doing the
Okay.
boxes. So
Yeah.
I started following along. And as I was keeping up with what was happening in the LJL sphere, I started to find the overlap in social media influencers that I really like who talk about identity and justice and how we can all create more inclusive spaces.
Hmm.
And several of them I found out through research for today's episode are ambassadors for LJL.
Yeah.
And with that being said, um, how do you become an LJ, like a Little Justice Leaders leader?
Yeah.
And how could our listeners, if they're interested in online activism, kind of get plugged in with you and your team?
Great question. So there's kind of a few ways it's happened, and I think it's happened very naturally for the first few years. We just made an intentional effort to really build community online, right? So we connected with folks who were talking about these things. I've met many of these folks like in person now, who, I originally met on Instagram through this work. And so a lot of that kind of just transpired naturally of like connecting with people with like-minded, interests who were sharing similar things and whose work I admired. And then after a couple of years, we got very, very intentional about what I was talking about before, making sure that there were multiple perspectives represented in every issue we were talking about. So, for example, when we were building one of our subscription boxes, and if the theme was disabilities, then we would have 3 to 5 disabled activists helping support and create that content. And that's when they officially became like a Little Justice Leaders content leader is what we called them at the time. And we would have so many because we wanted multiple perspectives represented in every box, right? One disabled activist has the point of view of one person with a disability. And we wanted so much more than that. We wanted it to be complexified. We wanted it to be not this like tokenism, one person knows all, there is only one perspective, right? We really believed in like showing a lot of diversity even within each issue we talked about. And so as you can imagine, 3 to 5 folks per month, times about 4 years that I think we really did that consistently. And we built just this incredible community of activists, educators, people who care about justice. And to your question about how it happened, like how they were selected, it was not as systematic as you might think. Someone might reach out to us and be like, "Hey, you should cover this topic." And I'd be like, "Great, are you an expert in it? Let's talk." And then who else do you know? I might just post on our Instagram, "Hey, who knows people who have expertise on this topic?" Or I would just randomly reach out to people's accounts who talk about a certain topic, like, "Hey, you see, you're an expert on this. Like, do you want to work with us?" And that's kind of it would snowball from there. And then I would just tell people, "Oh, we're doing this other topic," and they would be like, "Let me connect you to the people." Um, so they for listeners, I mean, if you do want to get involved, there's so many ways, but just reaching out to us and just being like, "Hey, like here's what I'm interested in, here's what I can provide, here's how I can support." And we're always open to collaborations.
That's so awesome. Going a little off book because this talking with you about your work, I can see it in your face, like the joy that it's bringing, and I love
Yeah.
that. In your dream reality, where does Little Justice Leaders go in the next few years?
Yes. So in my dream, I think there's two main things, and this probably changes depending on the day that you ask me. But my greatest dream would be that Little Justice Leaders curriculum or social justice curriculum in general just becomes a standard practice of elementary education. And so that's like the big probably not in the next few years, but long term, like would just love. And so in the next few years, that looks like partnering with as many schools as we can to to get our curriculum out to more young people. And the schools are the important piece here because, like I said, we don't want teachers having to pay out of pocket. We don't want parents and caregivers having to like pay out of pocket. We know that some kids, they're just not going to get this at home with their parents and caregivers. So we really want it to be at school. And so that's the first piece. And then the second piece, I think, is really just building that community, continuing to strengthen that community we were just talking about online, because I think there's also so much opportunity for us to create resources and share them for free, that in a way that teachers, caregivers can use right away. And I think that has been really powerful. It has felt very powerful when we've been able to respond to current events or, things that folks are thinking about and talking about and give caregivers and teachers really tangible resources for that.
That's so beautiful. Oh, I'm excited for you.
Thank
Um,
you.
in terms of our listeners and supporters of yours who tune in, where can people find you online?
Yeah, so pretty much anywhere you go online, just at Little Justice Leaders is where you're going to find us. We are probably most active on Instagram. So if you're really looking for, lots of resources, Instagram's a good place to start at Little Justice Leaders. But we do have an email list too, which is where you'll get kind of more in-depth resources. So you can get that at ljl.education/10 tips. That's the number 10. It's called 10 tips because the first thing you're going to get is 10 tips for talking to kids about social justice. So ljl.education/10 tips. We do have a website, littleJusticeLeaders.com. If you're interested in, one of our like paid memberships, either or our paid membership for caregivers and teachers, or our school-based membership for if you're, a school leader and you're interested in this program for your school. So those are kind of those two options as well. But definitely I would start with like the Instagram, and the email list is a good place to just dip your toes in, get a sense of what we offer and what kind of resources we have.
That's awesome. That's all the time we have for today. So thank you again for joining us. This was really fun.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Priscilla.
Of course. This podcast is written and co-produced by me, Priscilla Williams. Filming, editing, and co-produced by Jess Hewlin, and executive produced by Jordan Owen and Justin Hudson. This is a special production on behalf of Children's Literacy Initiative made possible by donors like you.